Thank you so much, Fernando. I will commend. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure for me. Also, thank all the participants who faced this terrible weather in Lisbon to be here with us this morning, enjoying the Lisbon conference. And of course, also thank very much and welcome the participants in this panel. If you allow me, we'll use your first names to make it more simple. So Fernando, Madalena, Shankar, and Fidel. It's a great pleasure, and I propose that we proceed after me introducing a few questions by short interventions on your part. I would say 5 to 10 minutes, and then a second round to make it a bit more lively. And of course, after the break, everybody's invited to participate in the discussion, so keep your questions and comments for the second part of this session. Nationalisms, Identities and Globalization. Very easy panel this morning. Topics that are really simple. So I'm joking, of course. We are dealing with an equation of what some scholars would call contested concepts, maybe even essentially contested concepts. Concepts which meaning is diverse and do not have not the agreement of its users. So there are many dimensions for each one of these concepts that we can consider. Anyway, there is something about each one of these concepts, despite the various interpretations, that we might take as some kind of basic definition, characteristics of these concepts that most users would agree on. So for globalization, the idea is that we're talking about changes, transformations in human experience regarding time and space. Basically, we're talking about an acceleration of time and a compression of space. This is something that everybody would agree on, that globalization is about. These profound transformations at multiple levels, cultural, political, social, that challenge fundamentally borders, local and national borders in our social experience. The dissent is mainly about the causes and the impacts of these processes. I will leave that for the participants. For nationalism, well, we could stay days, weeks, months, years talking about nationalism. We won't. I think there is one definition, a short one, by an English clergy, Ralph William Inge, that captures the two main characteristics of nationalism that I think we also could agree on, is that a nation, he says, is a group of people that invents a common past and hates its neighbors. So there's something of identification and opposition and differentiation here, which are the two main characteristics of the third concept, identity. Identity is probably the most contested of all these three concepts, but it necessarily involves talking about identification, what the answer to the question, who are we? And usually that is done through a positive identification. We describe who we are by underlining certain characteristics, but also and mainly and sometimes dominantly by opposing to others. So establishing differences in relation to others, and sometimes even maybe demonizing others. So these are contested concepts, first note. The second note is, of course, that these are not new concepts. The debates involving the interactions and between globalism and nationalism and identity are old debates. Yesterday we were talking about this. So I think that the panel will have to deal with the main question, that is, what is new about this? I think that the problem we are facing and we are bringing to the panel regards the growth, the development of some form of nationalism, recent forms of nationalism that some would call populist nationalism, thus based on the opposing a majority, the people, which is galvanized against minorities that might be the elites or the immigrants that are demonized, based on a mobilization of identity and identity questions that is very strong, that promote protectionism, closure, exclusion, that where political fight is not anymore based on a rational confrontation of ideas, but more of a confrontation between tribes, where emotion is more important than reason, which of course leads to the phenomena we know as affective polarization. So this form of nationalism, maybe there are many other meanings and other forms emerging, re-emerging and being contested, but this is a recent phenomena that has been identified and connected to globalization. So I believe that our task is that while some look at this form of nationalism as a reaction to the growing globalization, and somehow our losing of control of our lives because of the effects of globalization, others will probably defend that nationalism and globalization are not necessarily incompatible, and that it is possible to build a globalized world that still coexists with some of the good characteristics of nationalism, if that is the case. So the question for you, and I will stop and give you the floor, is what is there, what's the novelty in this equation? What is new there? How do globalization and nationalism coexist today? And more specifically, I would add, to what extent was our inability to manage globalization, economic globalization, minimizing its effects on inequality and justice, that opened the doors to these pernicious forms of nationalism that most believe question democracy itself. So I think this is enough for us to start, and maybe I will revert the order and start with Shankar. If you will, since yesterday we were talking about the fact that this is not new. So the question, what is new about this equation now?
Thank you, Helena, and thank you for having me here. It's good of you to ask me. And thank you, Helena, for reminding us that all of these nationalism identities, these are all social constructs, and that they're not new, that we've been here before. I think Europe knows this best. If you think back to 1850 to about 1914, you had the same combination of a globalized world economy and the growth of nationalism, actually the apotheosis of nationalism. And depending on where you were, it looked very different. If you were European, it ended badly, this combustible combination of nationalism, globalization. It ended in war and world wars, two world wars, which ultimately destroyed Europe's power itself relative. But if you were American or Russian, it actually led to the growth and the rise of these powers in the world. And if you were in the colonized world, it encouraged, in fact, the growth of nationalism in the colonies and ultimately to decolonization, because the wars themselves created the conditions for decolonization. So you have a paradox here, a paradox where, depending on where you are, what you are, geopolitically at least, it looks very different, the advantages of this combination of nationalism and globalization. And frankly, they feed on each other. Nationalism feeds on the threat to identity that globalization represents. How do we differ today? Because that's the question you asked us. In two ways. One is, today the threat from globalization is much more apparent to identity, is much more apparent because of what technology has done. Everyone can see in the palm of their hands how the rest of the world lives, and it creates aspirations. Secondly, the globalized economy, the single globalized economy to which we are all part, it doesn't matter where you are, east or west, developed, underdeveloped, we're all part of one single Western-led capitalist global economy. And that economy demands mobility. So people are, well, urbanization, globalization, they're pulled out of their comfortable clan, family, village, and more than half the world's population now is urban. And their identity, therefore, gets much more threatened, much more easily threatened. So you now have a situation where that combination, again, of globalization, nationalism, creates fertile ground for populist appeals. Once the global economy started slowing after the global financial crisis in 2008, performance legitimacy becomes much harder for regimes. And populists, therefore, start appealing to charisma and to hyper-nationalism, a populist form of nationalism. And this is where the difference actually comes. They do the old things that nationalists have always done, which is, say, try and create this mythical past of one nation, one identity, one creed, one language, one whatever. But what's more lethal is that they have technology today at their service. We had always thought that ICT, that the internet and so on, would be an instrument of freedom. And yet it's equally an instrument of actually surveillance and control today in our societies. And globalization has increased inequality, both within and between societies. So you have this paradox. We're today in a world where a higher proportion of humanity leads better, healthier, longer lives, more prosperous lives than ever before in history. India pulled 140 million people out of poverty in 11 years. Look at what China's done. 250 million people out of poverty in the last 20 years. It's remarkable. And yet, if you ask people, they all feel much more insecure. Of course, every generation thinks they're special and theirs is the worst time possible. But in our case, we really believe this. And why do we believe this? Because we're cut loose, we're adrift in this globalized world. We don't have the old certainties. We're not sure what to believe in. And frankly, the new authoritarians feed our fears because they live off our fears. And their political survival depends on it. So the consequences, maybe we can go into later, but we're therefore in a really paradoxical world. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that everything is doom and gloom. Because if you actually think back in history, when was mankind most innovative and most creative? Think of the 6th century BC, Pythagoras, Buddha, Confucius, whatever. Complete chaos, warring states. You think of 10th to 12th century. Again, paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing. Chaos in the world. You think of pre-modern Europe, war everywhere. War after war after war. And yet, Industrial Revolution, fiscal ingenuity, it's incredible what Europe did. So maybe we're not going to do so badly out of the chaos that we see around us, I hope.
Thank you. Putting some perspective into the questions is always useful. So I'm going the other way around regarding the program. So Fidel, please, the floor is yours, even if you're not here with us.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm talking from Ghana, West Africa, and I would like to take this question from the African point of view and the African perspective. Now, I'm so happy that you gave a very succinct definition to globalization, and you mentioned the acceleration of time and the compression of space. So in the 15th century, when sailors set out from Portugal to reach India, they were looking for a new route to India, other than the overland route that Marco Polo had used to reach the Far East. So it was more of the acceleration of time and the compression of space in order to reach India. And it was through that process that Don Diego de Azambuja reached the western coast of Africa, where I am speaking from. And when the Portuguese got to West Africa, they came in to trade. And they met people who had unique identity, and that has to do with language, history, common history, as is defined here. Now, during the time, African countries identified, or African people identified themselves with their ethnicities. That is the various tribes, groups, and things like that. So we did not have the nation state as we have today. And then in the 19th century, when colonialism started, so that is to say that colonialism did not start with the coming in of the Portuguese. It was initially trade, and then eventually in the 19th century, as other European countries joined, it became colonialism. And colonialism exploited these identities that the Europeans came to meet in Africa. So in West Africa, you find the Fantis, the Ashantis, and the Ewe, the Yoruba, Igbo in present-day Nigeria, and other groups, the Buganda in Angola and other places, where the European powers had exploited these identities in order to entrench their rule in Africa. And that is very significant because then you get to know that identities have been exploited at certain times and for certain purposes. Now, during colonialism, there was this kind of sensitization. So the nationalism that we currently talk about became more intense, that as Africans wanted to be free from European grip. So Francophone Africa, you found people like Houphouët-Boigny trying to sensitize their people to be free from their colonialism. In Ghana, we had President Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and so on and so forth. So that actually redefined identities. So it was no more about ethnicities, it was about the kind of borders that Europeans had created in the latter part of the 19th century in the Berlin Conference. So then if you found yourself in present-day Ghana, that was called the Gold Coast, then different identities or different ethnicities came together to fight for independence. And in the mid-20th century, many African countries, based on that kind of nationalism, based on the borders that were created, fought for independence. That is very significant. Now, just after independence, identities in Africa went beyond ethnicities and the nation state to more ideological. So you found the Soviet Union and the West trying to use Africans as a turf for competition. And we found the issue of leftism and then the right-wing leftists fighting against each other. So in Angola, we found the MPLA and UNITA fighting. And we found the Soviet Union backing the MPLA, that is currently in office, and the West backing UNITA and other groups. In Mozambique, we found something similar. Then the Cold War ended in the early 1990s. With the end of the Cold War, the issue of modern globalization, as we talk about, became paramount. So people felt that, well, with the absence of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a need to toe the line of globalization. So it means many African countries started drafting. So globalization has its political facet, cultural facet, economic facet, and other facets. And at the economic facet, many African countries went to the Bretton Woods institutions in Washington to do economic restructuring and things like that. Now, others also drafted constitutions to move to more liberal systems, move towards more liberal systems in Africa. So by that, then it meant that the ethnic identities were subsided. They existed, but it became second to a more prosperous future. And many African countries subscribed to this. Then with the decades going, as global competition for Africa became renewed or was revamped, that is the growing assertiveness of China becoming a global power, Russia reasserting its interest, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Moscow was not so much interested in Africa, except for some few places like Algeria and other places where they sold some arms and engaged in some business. But currently, Moscow has revamped its interest in Africa. And with that multipolarity, we are still going back to that kind of ethnic identities. It's becoming more intense. We find more rebellions, we find ethnic clashes, because then this competition is leading to different parts in the global system, or different powers in the global system supporting one side or the other against the other. So currently in the Sahel, we find that happening. Tuareg nationalism, and how some powers are backing Tuaregs against the juntas that have taken power, also backed by Moscow. So with this, I would say that yes, nationalism is on the rise in Africa as well, but the African nationalism is not similar to what is happening in Europe. Because in Africa, borders are artificial, and we find so many nations in one state. And so the nationalism is translating into civil wars and inter-ethnic clashes. Yeah, so I think that that is a long history, and I'll end here so that subsequent questions can be asked. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, reminding us of the importance to put things into perspective and take into account space and time, and how much this phenomena may vary regarding the mainstream definition we can have of what happens here in the West, I would say. So, Madalena.
Well, thank you, Helena. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And of course, nationalism is one of my most favorite topics to study. And looking at the panel today, I thought it could be interesting to have the European perspective as the oldest continent with important nationalist movements. And I think really the question today for the world, for Europe as well, is whether liberal democracy is going to survive this re-emergence of nationalism as a force in world politics. And I think this is a question which is very much open. And to help think about this question, I thought of doing a little excursion through European history of nationalism, and to see how in Europe adaptations to nationalism away from a hateful, exclusivist ethnic force have emerged in time in response to democratization and to European integration. So this is not at all a new question for Europe. It has, of course, been devastated twice by two wars fueled by ideology based on nationalism, and we see it coming back today. But I would say that if we look into authors of nationalism, the ones that look at societal, the social forces that somehow were based, in which nationalism was based or responded, they looked at a process at the moment of transition from rural societies into industrial urban societies, and move away from these face-to-face communities into wider anonymous communities, and saw nationalism as providing the glue for these new societies. So it is not also only globalization that is creating nationalist movements, it's also the need in many parts of the world as it transitions from rural societies to more developed ones to have an identity and also to create states which are coherent. I think in India it's also very much the story. So in Europe, this also was a process that happened in the 19th century, and nationalism was very much a force of modernity. Now, in the 19th century, also in the early 20th century, democratization, or the process of democratization of politics after the French Revolution, created the need to respond, to combine these two forces. Of course, nationalism is not easy to combine with democracy. It is a claim for a unitarian political entity, and democracy asks for divisions. So how do you combine the two? I would say that the answer emerged in the form of civic nationalism, a nationalism that is not based on ethnic ties and primordial communities, but is rather a nation that is based on the willing citizens that want to be part of it. This is very much the French and the American nationalism that was developed in the 19th centuries and kind of made its way into our days, and it is somehow the nationalism that is compatible with a democratic system. After the Second World War, there was also in Europe a new development, the development of a new form of relation between states to overcome the Franco-German enmity that had destroyed Europe again twice. And this form of integration required that states jointly exercise their sovereignty. So to jointly exercise their sovereignty, they cannot hate each other, right? So they have to come up with a new way to deal with each other without ditching completely their identity. That's what happened in Europe. We created the European communities and then the European Union. And so the form of nationalism that I call the extroverted sort of nationalism is the nationalism that sees relations with other nations in a positive light. And this was the story that was very important, especially in Germany, in the reconfiguration of politics after Second World War. The center-right party reformulated the whole narrative on relations with France, but also on its own, on the whole history of Germany, and this was, it is still today the basis of the pro-German, the pro-European part of the German right that we know that is being threatened by the extreme right. So I would finish here. I think it is a 200-year history with important lessons for the world. We know that this is not a closed history in Europe as well. We see these populist movements based on a hateful ethnic nationalism still threatening and being powerful all over the continent. But at least there's another story. Thank you.
Thank you, Madalena. There are other stories, and exploring those other possibilities and the future we can build upon the lessons of the past, which are diverse, is something that could come out of this panel. So having said this, Fernando, it's your turn.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you to Club de Lisboa for this invitation and the opportunity to share with you some views from Latin American perspective and from Chile in particular. Thanks to Fernando, the director, for this invitation, and Gulbenkian, of course. So I'm going to start looking back. 2 million years ago, probably, when the first human being stood on 2 feet. Since then, the human being developed 2 constants. Walk, start to walk, to emigrate, and immediately the human being developed the capacity to kill other people. And then started the arm industry to develop. And for a very simple way, the human being has been till today, still emigrate, still walk, as we can see every day, and kill each other. So we are living today on this generation under the shadow of the 20th century. All the problems that were not solved by the politicians in the last century are still here, present with us. Among them, nationalism. And if we review the history, after the Second World War, as has been mentioned today by Madalena, we can see, I remember what the people in San Francisco, when they wrote the Charter of United Nations, what is written in the preamble of this. And I'm going to repeat it because everybody seems that it's forgotten. It's written, we the people of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and so on and so on. The preamble mentioned all the problems that we still face. Human rights, gender issues, ask for equal of women and men, and all this, and to avoid the problem of social differences. So yesterday, everybody spoke here about war, about the big powers, China, Russia, United States, critical minerals. Only one person yesterday mentioned Latin America, which is full of resources, raw materials, lithium, copper, gold. We have the Amazon. And then when we spoke about nationalism, we have to think that in the 20th century, in Europe, 2 world wars were originated here. So colonial people from Africa, from India, were fighting for the big colonial powers in the First World War. Of the Second World War, we have the crudest symbol of nationalism in the Mussolini, in Italy, or in Germany, with Hitler, Nazism, and the racism. In Asia, Japan, the Japan imperial nationalism, everybody knows what they did in Asia. What they did, the colonial power, France and England in the Middle East, when they did the borders after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire disappeared. So if we see the history, probably Europe is the continent that most war has provoked in the mankind history. On the contrary, in Latin America, when we speak about nationalism, we have to review history, because nationalism started with the independence of our countries from the Spanish colonialism at the beginning of the 19th century. So, but nobody mentioned the indigenous people that were the owner of the territories of Latin America, of America, all America. And that was completely ignored with the creation of the new republics and the new countries that were created. Masses of indigenous people was incorporated to the new republics. And then was the creation of a national anthem, the flags, shields, and whatever. And then after everybody in Latin America was happy because we sent back the Spanish colonial power. We created our republic, and then start the fight for the territories. Then border problems. And we see what happened in North America. Mexico was a country after the independence of 4.6 million square kilometers. They lost more than 2 million square kilometers with the United States. California, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, part of Texas, etc., etc. Today is almost half of this territory. Same happened in South America with the wars between the Pacific War, Chile against Peru and Bolivia, the War of Chaco, etc., etc. But all these disputes are part of the past. Today, we are a peaceful continent in terms of wars between countries. The last war in Latin America was against the colonial UK colonial domination of the Malvinas Island, Argentina and UK in 1981. We have other kind of problem, other kind of violence in Latin America, because we were still under the shadow of the United States in the 20th century. When we declared independence, very rapidly, the President of the United States, President Monroe, said, "America for the Americans." Why? Because they were afraid of the power of the British Empire or the other influences in Latin America. But rapidly, it was transformed. America for the United States. In the 20th century, we had military interventions of the United States in most of the countries. And then the military coup to protect US interests. After the Cuban Revolution, it was worse. It was the CIA throwing governments, etc., etc. So the history has been terrible for us in this part. But in Europe, that people say that after the Second World War, Europe will live in peace, the creation of European Union, what is called today, they always forgot that you had a war in Yugoslavia. 100,000 people died at the beginning of the 90s. And what happened? 7 new countries were created after the civil war in Yugoslavia. 7. Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Kosovo. The last one seemed artificial creation, but there it is. So when we speak about nationalism, it's not a simple issue. I will stop here because
Thank
I
you,
have many
Fernando.
things to say still. But
No, for us to have a second round, very
because
interesting
I speak
points.
for 200 years of our independence.
So we just also have had a compression in time and acceleration. Sorry, a compression in space and acceleration in time. So we have visited all this historical evidence, and which is definitely very interesting for our discussion. We did some diagnosis, but now for the second round, I would, besides asking you to comment, maybe your fellow panelists, I'd also address the question of what to do. Then how to move from the diagnosis, from the lessons learned, from variety in history and time, to what to do. How can we prevent? How can we ensure that we won't have the type of nationalism or globalization that will lead us to more wars? How can we work to get to have peace, or to control the forces that are so negative for our democracies coming out from these movements? And I would leave you with this question, and another one on immigration. It's one of the identity questions that has been raised more frequently and more controversial. Asking you also to comment on the way how it has been weaponized in the debate on nationalism and on identity, and used as a weapon, in fact, in our discussions, knowing that there is a lot of we have a problem, of course, of irregular migration. We need to regulate flows, but we know that there's a lot of disinformation and myths about migration, that we live in an era of mass migration. It seems that everybody is moving. We have always been moving, and Fernando is right, we started walking. That is part of the human kind. But only a very small percentage of the population of the world lives in countries which are not the ones where they were born. That is the definition of immigrant. Then another myth that migrations are global. No, they are mostly regional migrations. Then the flow comes from poor countries to rich countries. No, there are as many migrations within rich countries and within poor countries than between poor and rich countries. Or even, many other myths or ideas about migrations which are not totally correct, like the poor are the ones that migrate. It's not true. Qualifications is a variable that explains the propensity to migrate. So could you please comment on what can we do to control the perverse effects of some kinds of nationalism? How do we face then the disinformation in the weaponization of identity topics as migration? The floor is yours now, Shankar, and I give you a little bit more time if I have.
Thank you. Thank you. These are tough questions. And I think we all know that there's a problem with the way nationalism has developed now in a globalized world, right? So where do we attack the problem? For me, the key is attacking inequality, both between societies and within societies. Why do I say this? Because if you think of it, many of the things that bother us, illegal migration, internal displacement. I mean, there's, when you look at the numbers of internally displaced people in societies, you look at the causes of the kinds of civil wars that Fidel was talking about just now. A lot of this is caused by inequality, and the aspirations, the hate, the anger that you see also comes out of this. And it actually feeds the wrong form of nationalism. For me, there's a distinction between nationalism, which is hating not just your neighbors, anybody who is different, but also, and patriotism, which is love of your own country, which is fine. I mean, that's an acceptable sentiment. And how do you transform nationalism into patriotism, into some way of living with other people, unless you can settle this basic problem of inequality? It's interesting. You look at the distribution of power in the world today. It's actually much more even than it was before. In the Cold War, the two blocs controlled over 80% of world GDP and military power. Today, if you look at China and the US, they control less than 50% of GDP, a little more than 50% of military power in the world. So you actually have objective conditions where everybody should be able to participate in the way the world is run. But that doesn't happen. That's not at all. In fact, you have institutions which enforce inequality, in a sense, in the world, the way it works. And for me, within societies also, a lot of the potential for violence, for trouble, basically, and the drive to feed this nationalism comes from internal inequality, and the fact that globalization has made that inequality so much worse. So for me, that's the key that I think would unlock the problem. There's no easy solution to this. I mean, it's because there's a whole host of things that will need to be done. But that's where I would go. On migration, though, I think, I'm not sure that you can fight human nature. People will migrate in search of opportunity, in search of a better future for their children. And you're quite right. The myth is that the poor migrate, that all migration is in one direction, and that this is a threat to societies. Frankly, in most cases, migrants make bigger contributions to the economy than the established populations. I mean, you've seen this happen over and over again. They're willing to do jobs that residents are not willing to do in some places. In other places, they actually contribute. And yet, you see the myth that they eat dogs and they do this and they do that. It's quite frightening how this is used politically. How do you stop that?
Exactly on that. There is a question on the topics in our program, which is exactly that. Why is there so much resistance, even when these contributions of migrants are so evident?
I think it's because, frankly, there's political utility for some people in using it. And the only answer to that is actually to make sure that you vote them out, that you keep them out of power. But there's enough fear generated by the neo-authoritarians that it actually, and this is, for me, the problem. So for me, it's not that economic integration is going to solve this problem. Europe is terribly integrated, actually. Germany and Britain were the two biggest trading partners with each other in 1914. Didn't stop a war. I'm not sure that economic integration is the answer. And frankly, if you look at European politics over the last 15 years, it's not that European integration has therefore led to a benign form of politics. So I'm a little careful about drawing those conclusions, that integration can solve our problems and that if we only behave like brothers and realize that we were. I think we need to change the objective conditions in which we operate. And that's where I think inequality will help. Dealing with inequality helps even with migration and so on.
Thank you so much. Fidel, to you now.
So thank you very much for this question. So as I mentioned, in Africa, borders were drawn without the consent of the various nationalities. So different nationalities became nations, or nation states, or joined to become single states. Now, currently, what my solution to that, to the nationalism and the conflict and the competing interest, is that there is a need to adopt democracy in a more serious way. In Africa, many people mention that, well, democracy is not for Africa. Africa is more of a monarchy, traditionally monarchy system and all that. But no, I have debated against this. Look, it is by no fault of Africa that all these countries, all these nations come together to form states. However, that is the fact on the ground, de facto. I mean, there is no way to change that. No country is willing to cede any or allow secessionism within its territory. It took decades for South Sudan to secede from Sudan. It took very serious warfare for Eritrea to break away from Ethiopia. We don't need that across Africa. So what we need is democracy. With democracy, the different nationalities are well represented. The different nationalities will have a say in the nation-building processes. And through that, we would be able to avoid the negative effect of nationalism, the unnecessary clashes between ethnicities, as we see in the DRC, as we see in other places. Currently, Mozambique is having its elections, and that is very good because that country fought long civil war after Portugal granted it independence because of the different identities. But currently, there are elections going on. We find that in Angola, well, the same party has been in office for a long time, but UNITA is currently a recognized party in the country, and it's part of the nation-building process. Over time, it could win elections. So with democracy, I think that in Africa, we can we'll be able to suppress the negative effect of nationalism that has become a centrifugal force separating countries. Now, with immigration or migration, I was supposed to be in Portugal with you. Unfortunately, because of the rigid processes. In Ghana is the Dutch embassy that grants Portuguese visas. And initially when I applied, I was told that I do not have enough evidence or enough proof that I'll come back when I attend the conference. I will come back to Ghana, and that is the law, that is the process. But is to tell you that the migration question is a difficult one, because deep down I know that I will come to Portugal and return to Ghana because I need to be in Ghana to continue my work. But then it cannot be easily understood. And so, and as my previous speaker said, the professor said, we need to redefine a lot of things and to know that we cannot stop human nature. You cannot stop migration, no matter what people would like to move. But we also have to understand that many people have their fears, because if you are entering my country without the processes, you are just crossing the Mediterranean to reach me, and I cannot have you in my books that you are in my country, then I cannot control what you can do. So that can also increase crime. So I think that we have to look at this in a holistic way in order to tackle it well. But in so doing, especially in Europe, where it has become the center of attention, there must be cooperation between European countries, the North African countries, and the source of this migration. And then I'll go back to what my previous speaker mentioned about inequality. If the socioeconomic problems are solved in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, many people will not find it necessary to migrate for greener pastures. Even though we will still have migration, it will not be as dangerous as we see today. Because what we see in the Mediterranean is, as a result, the push factors are socioeconomic. And so if there is enough cooperation among countries to solve these problems, I think that the supply side of this migration could be managed well in order to have a more regularized and a more or less dangerous migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fidel. You are the living proof of one of the problems we're discussing now, the difficulties, the growing challenges regarding migrations. Welcome back, and Fidel, you're still there, so thank you as well. As promised, I'll give the floor to Madalena and then Fernando for a few minutes to finish the round we were having. And then I will open the floor for questions. So prepare your questions, make sure to identify yourselves and be short. Thank you. Madalena.
Thank you. Just two small points on the what to do to counter this nationalist wave. I think one thing a previous point is that nationalism got a very bad name after the Second World War, of course, and it was considered the root of all evils, and it is true that in its extreme forms it is very bad. But what I try to say in my presentation is also that nationalisms created stable, modern, and often helped to create democratic nation states. And so this is a legacy that cannot be done away, and we cannot think that we have stable societies without a certain cohesion. Of course, every society will define what it sees as its cohesion, and of course economic inequalities are an impediment to that, but also often the question of migration can be weaponized because national states also don't give the impression that they have a strategy to manage it. So I think it is important that national states give this impression, or actually control it at least, towards their citizens. So this is one point. And the second point, it came to me very much during this this campaign in the United States, in which the Democratic Party very much reclaimed a patriotic national unity discourse. And I think this is very important, that this is not left to the populist undemocratic forces, that they can steal it in a certain way for their very well-known agenda, but that liberals identify and pursue benign forms of the national identity and are able to convince the electorate that they are defending them. So these are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Madalena, for being short but very, very, incisive in these questions. Fernando?
Thank you. I didn't mention when we spoke about nationalism, the situation in Israel, because it's a very sensitive matter. But we are seeing today in Israel is maximum of nationalism, and I don't want to use other words for that, but we have to keep in mind what is going on there. Then about migration, I completely agree what Shankar was mentioned about the inequality. Inequality and globalization, I think that in some way are connected, because nobody wants to leave his own country and move to another culture, to another country, if they have conditions in their own homeland. But we see Europe can teach us how people left this continent, people from Ireland, from Germany in the 19th century, because they were starving. And today, in the countries in Africa or in some countries, Latin America, or they are facing similar situation. Fail the politics. Politics also is part of this. They have their responsibility. Why people leave, why people emigrate. And I'm going to speak about what we are living in Chile. In Chile, in the last 5 years, we received about 700,000 of people from Venezuela, only from Venezuela, plus Colombia, people from Peru. Is because Chile had better conditions and people could work and they have some kind of a social security. But the problem is we can follow that when a family come to live in our country, the first one are for economic reason. Then they rejoin families. But after that, what we can see is delinquency. We are facing in Latin America a lot of violence. In our case, in Chile, it's not that we were saint or that we didn't have delinquency before, but today we are facing a wave of delinquency as we've never seen before. So what is the reaction of the people? Xenophobia. The difference with Europe, that you receive people from different culture, different language, and different countries. We receive most people from Latin America with the same religion, Christian, the same language, mainly, but different way of life. So, and those people who immigrant goes to live to the popular areas because it's pay less for rents or whatever, and then created xenophobia. In Chile, we never had this before, but today it's reflected, of course, in the politics. Right-wing parties everywhere are raising, and one of the reasons is the immigration. We saw what happened in Germany in the last 3 elections in some of the states of Germany with the rise of the extreme right-wing parties. So it's a big problem.
Well, thank you, Fernando, for bringing some easy topics to complexify our debate. So now I open the floor and ask you to, again, identify yourselves and be brief so that we can have a lively debate. I have questions here. I suppose there should be a microphone for the first row, and then the second, it's coming. Just a minute.
My name is Hung Tran from the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And thank you very much, all the panelists, for very insightful comments. My 2 short questions is, given the title Nationalism, Identities, and Globalization, number 1, what do you think is the main motivation behind the right-wing populist movement that we talk about by all panelists, but not really in a very systematic way? So what are the main motivations? 1, what is the role of nativism in this title? You mentioned nationalism, but not nativism. Nativism means favoring native-born citizens at the expense of foreign-born citizen immigrants. So how much do you think nativism play a role in this phenomenon? And secondly, we mentioned inequality as one of the motivation for the division, but how about the phenomenon of the pushback by white males against all the measures in the past decades in favor of equal rights for women, for minorities, and so on and so forth, at the expense of their conception of the traditional role of white men in the family?
Thank you very much. If you agree, I will collect 1 or 2 more questions and then come back to the panel. So in the second row.
Muito bom dia. Meu nome é João Rocha Pereira, sou consultor internacional de segurança e trabalho sobretudo em prevenção. Sempre foi a minha tónica e continuo sempre a falar em prevenção. Quero cumprimentar a professora Helena Carreiras e todo o painel pelas vossas excelentes intervenções. E pergunto a mim mesmo, muitas vezes, como consultor, como é que nós podemos prevenir, como é que podemos atenuar, mitigar estes problemas todos que foram aqui referidos por todos, do nacionalismo, identidades e globalização, das guerras civis, como referiu o Fidel, que eu aproveito para cumprimentar, já nos conhecemos de outros fóruns, e da sua excelente...
Se falar em inglês talvez seja mais fácil para ele, ou eu posso traduzir se quiser. Okay, se for breve eu traduzo a seguir.
Não, é só isso, só cumprimentá-lo. Eu pergunto a mim mesmo como é que podemos resolver estes problemas. Eu fiz o meu doutoramento em resolução de conflitos internacionais e psicologia da paz. Eu penso que a resolução pacífica de conflitos poderia muito bem ser um instrumento importante para resolver estes problemas. Outro problema que poderíamos tentar ajudar também a resolver estes problemas, outra solução, seria a educação para a paz. Efetivamente, se nós introduzirmos nas nossas escolas o civismo, os valores, os princípios, ensinarmos os miúdos a resolverem os seus próprios conflitos desde tenra idade, de certeza que vamos fazer melhores adultos e vamos mitigar estes problemas. O nacionalismo pode ser positivo, como referiu a professora Madalena, há aspectos positivos, mas quando saímos da zona, de facto, do bom senso e do equilíbrio e chegamos a extremismos e a fundamentalismos, obviamente que muitas vezes isso gera violência, gera guerras civis, gera terrorismo, e é isso que temos que tentar combater. E gostaria de saber a vossa opinião sobre isso. Muito obrigado. sobre as soluções, efetivamente.
Muito obrigado pela sua questão. So I will quickly translate. Fidel, the question was about prevention and the role that public education and peace education in particular can have as a contribution to solve the problems we've been identifying. One more question for the first round. Na quarta fila, por favor.
Hello. Hello. Thank you so much for this dialogue. For me, it's not as a question.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm from Iran Embassy in Lisbon. I can say that this is the nationalism, idealism, and globalization. This is something is opposite to each other. Nationalism against globalization. I think nationalism is rooted in the fear, in poverty, in fear from connect to each other, and forget about humanity. First of all, this road to these things. As Iran now hosting about 8 million migration from neighbors country, Afghanistan and some countries. They use all facility that as a nation others use it. But we look at this as a humanity. Humanity should help each other. My question that is, where is the humanity? Where we can find humanity? We all human beings. If the professor from Chile said is correctly, and from India also said very, very correctly, inequality is one of them. And the professor from Chile said, how you can block the migration to moving? Why? European and other, you cannot find the pure nation. From British going to United States, from Europe going to Africa, and this is mixed. But we cannot find, put ourselves in the above and say, nobody coming to our country. This is, we have to be against all ism. All ism, fascism, communism, all, everything. Because all is very nice word. With nice word, beautiful, but it's cover and fake and make brush the idea. And I think in this situation, in this new condition that world happen, we facing the challenge more than before. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now I think we can go back to the panel. I would add one question that I was talking to some students during the break. I don't know if you would like to put the question. Would you? Would you like to put the question? No? Yes? Go ahead. Go ahead. There's a young lady there in the... I think it was a nice question. Go ahead. You can speak in Portuguese and then I will translate, no problem.
I think nationalism and patriotism are not the same. And actually, I wanted to give my input about Zionism that was mentioned. I don't think... Sorry. I don't think Zionism is a matter of nationalism because it's an ideology that is way older than the state of Israel. So it's more a matter of colonialism and imperialism. And well, it had a patriotic reaction from the Palestinians. So patriotism is more like being proud of your nation, while nationalism is thinking your nation is superior to other nations. And it has more of an imperialist reaction of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. So back to the panel. Many different questions from the motivations of right-wing nationalism to prevention to distinguishing between patriotism and nationalism. You choose.
Well, first I want to thank the student who just spoke, because that's exactly how I think we should look at nationalism and patriotism and draw the distinction. It's very well said. The problem is that, you know, in practice, politicians use patriotism and try and turn it into nationalism for their own ends, for their own political ends, to stay in power, to gain power, and control over others. And I think that's where really the rubber hits the road. And as Hung Tran was saying, there are fundamental causes why they can do this. In order to do this, they play on the emotions. They play on fear. They play on hate. But when you ask what are the fundamental causes apart from inequality, I think they vary from society to society. In the US, I mean, I saw somewhere that in 1980, 84% of the population was white. Now it's down to something like 58% and probably declining pretty soon. So there's this dog whistle politics that you hear in the campaign, which is basically racist. And it feeds into the fear, as you said, of the white male who feels he's losing his position. In other places, it's different. I mean, in East Asia, in China at least, there's this narrative of the century of humiliation, which Chiang Kai-shek used to write every night in the top right-hand page of his diary, never forget national humiliation. Mao Zedong never did. He told the story of the Chinese people as heroes who had stood up against imperialism and feudalism. And he never used the phrase. But it's back again now. And it's part of the patriotic education campaign. So that's where it shades into. And so for me, this is where the problem is. And the only way to build defenses against it is not just education, because frankly, children don't make wars and ordinary people don't make wars. It's leaders who make wars. But the only check on those leaders is the people, the children who grow up to be adults, you, in other words. So that's where I come to the second question. What you said about education is necessary. It's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition to deal with this. We have to deal with it politically. It's a political problem that we have to deal with politically, is what I would say.
Okay, thank you. Fidel? We can't hear you. There's something wrong with...
Yeah, my mic was off, sorry. Yeah, so thank you very much. So I'll move straight to the public education and how that could help to water down the adverse effect of nationalism, and especially in Africa. Now, after the end of the Cold War, many African countries realized some stability and therefore invested heavily in education. So now if you look at Africa, it's, I hear people talk about low education rate in Africa, but no, now it is getting very high. And we in the global north countries, we find so many Africans doing so well. And they had their university educations back in Africa. Myself, I've had all my education in Africa. And so I would say that public education is good, letting people know the effects of their actions, the importance of cohesion, the importance of tolerance. Because then if you feel superior to the other person will listen to you for some time, but at a point, there'll be a pushback. And so all these is very important to let people know that, well, living side by side people is a thing to do. Again, even in the issue of migration, we still need public education. So for so many people, they are told that when you are in North Africa, you see Europe. And so the dangerous waters of the Mediterranean is not mentioned. The fact that when he finds himself in Libya, he sees some island, or in Morocco, he sees Spain, is enough. And so that education is necessary to be told that, well, even crossing the Sahara itself is hazardous. And sometimes when people weigh the pros and cons of their actions before those actions are undertaken, they are more likely to be rational in their decision making. And so that will only come when you have good education and good information. For instance, in recent times, we found Africans fighting in Russia and in Ukraine. Most of them do not understand how that war is happening. And so that public education, as you mentioned, is very, very important. And so that will also come with infrastructural development and access, state presence. There are many places in Africa where the presence of the state is almost non-existent. So I think that in the case of Africa, we need more to do in order to realize this kind of educational levels. In Ghana, for instance, there are very few push factors, but you find so many Ghanaians making attempt to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. And in some communities, we found that it is not about poverty, it is about culture. They are known to be travelers. So when the young man start farming, he is farming to gather resources to cross the Mediterranean, to cross the Sahara and reach the Mediterranean and cross. And they've been doing that for decades. So how do you imbibe all these things into some form of comprehensive education that let them know that these journeys are not worth it? I think that I will leave with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madalena.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm not very hung about whether to call it benign nationalism or patriotism. I think it's okay to distinguish. I would just say that I'm a big believer in somehow how to say consolidated identities, and I think that when societies feel sufficiently stable, they don't have to exaggerate. So this nativism, which is basically saying that the society is made of people who somehow belong to our enlarged family, is actually nowadays in a modern society an exaggeration. It is, and it does point, and when it's very successful, I think it does point to a sense of insecurity. And this, of course, the raising importance of white man nationalism, I think, of course, comes from a certain sense of insecurity. And these things have to be taken seriously. They are not. They are not inventions. They are often real feelings, and one cannot just push them aside in the name of all the other minorities or all minorities. So to support minorities cannot or does not have to be done at the expense of some majorities. So that's my point.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you. I will mention briefly some of the questions that were sent to us here. Motivation for nationalism. Besides inequality, I would like to mention something that's always ignored about the native population in America, in Latin America, North America, that was completely ignored. When the European came, our people lost not only territories, they lost dignity, they lost religion, they lost gods, they lost everything, their culture. It was completely transformed. So we had civilization different from Europe, of course, in Mexico with the Mayas, Aztecas, or in Peru with the Inca Empire, all of these things were completely ignored. Europeans brought us black people as slaves that was incorporated in our country that we have today. So what about nationalism? We had some way of nationalism with Tupac Amaru in Peru as indigenous movement, but afterwards disappeared. Regarding solutions, if we have solutions, we can be candidate to the Nobel Prize. So don't ask us, we can provide solutions. So regarding humanity, we can say, I would like to say something. We have to save our planet. The environmental crisis we are facing could be very tragic. And you know why? According to our civilization, I think that we should be a priority to save the planet, because it's the way that we can continue kill each other, that we like to work. So if we don't have a planet, we cannot kill each other. We cannot fight more wars. So it's very important. And that's it.
Okay, so thank you so much. I would have another question to add, but I will refrain and give you the floor again for a couple of more questions. So one question here in the second row on the right, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kathy Peach. I'm the director of the Centre for Collective Intelligence Design at an innovation agency called Nesta in London. The first part of my question is about the role of identities. So I think it's fairly well known that people can hold multiple identities at any one point in time, and that identities are also mutable and flexible. People's identities change over time. And I think from the psychology literature and experiments, there is lots of evidence that actually identities are really very easily formed. So my question is, given the role of identities as perhaps a negative driver, can we also maybe think differently about the role of identity as a positive driver in this current context? Because again, there's also evidence that shows that collective identities can help drive pro-social behaviour, pro-environmental behaviour. So my question is, what are the new identities that might be needed to help us navigate these challenges? And whose role is it to build and nurture those new identities? Then a second question. So in the UK, we had far-right riots over the summer. And there's a very live debate happening now about how to respond to them. And there are politicians on one side saying, we just need to tackle the root causes. We need to deliver for people. We need to tackle the inequalities that are driving them. On the other hand, there are people from the US who are saying, well, Biden's really delivered for many of these people, and actually it's not helping, it's not solving the problem. So is there something beyond just solving inequality? Is there something that actually speaks to people feeling heard, listened to, valued, that perhaps we're missing at the moment?
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. There's another one over there. Could you see the gentleman? Yes, please. General.
Good morning again. Thanks to the panel and the coordinator. Thank you for your efforts to be on the line with the title we have here. My question is about the following a little bit.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm a Lieutenant General Martins Pereira. I'm a retired general from the Portuguese Army, and now I'm in academic move, you can say. My question is about yesterday some of the members of the panel in the morning arguing about the liberal regime failing to Africa and to Asia. And today we heard, coming from Fidel, namely from Africa, the importance of the democratic regimes and how to preserve the democratic regime to feed more equality, more protection to the identities, and more progress. My question is mainly for one of the, maybe the larger democracy in the world, and what you are seeing, how to preserve the many identities you have in India, and how your example could help some of the countries in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another one. Fernando, you want to? Okay.
Thank you. This is about Africa. This is one of the reasons why, Fidel, I like to read your posts. Because I have lots of friends, African friends, that are well in life. And they tell me, look, that thing of democracy is a Western invention. It's not for us in Africa. We live in other contextual, historical moment. What they mean and what I tell them is always the same. What you are telling me is that you prefer a regime in which you are led by an autocrat that have the power of the state and in which you have the employment assured. That's what you are telling me. Because when we speak about democracy, we are speaking about a regime in which the leader is choiced by those that he leads. That's the point. And there is nobody in Africa that is against this, except those that are in power. Thank you.
Well, that was a comment. Thank you, Fernando. So, coming back again, Shankar, please.
Well, that was really a good question about plural identities, and I think both of you touched that. It's, in fact, for me, that's part of the solution to the problem. When you said, can't identities be positive? Yes, certainly, if you think of yourself as Fernando said, in terms of a planetary identity, me as a human being, you can expand it. But also the idea that you can have multiple identities at the same time. The moment you do that, you introduce some level of pluralism in the sense of identity, immediately you're much more willing to accept difference. You're willing to accept others as having validity in themselves. And so for me, the solution is exactly what you pointed to when you mentioned, and this is beyond solving it, just inequality. Because yes, we have to deal with the objective factors which create the conditions for the kind of toxic nationalism that we see today, or the politics of fear and hate. And inequality is a big part of that. But there's also the whole subjective perspective, which for people to feel, I think the Chinese use the phrase discourse power, but it's more than discourse power. It's the feeling that you have a say in your own future, that you have some influence on this. The general was good enough to mention the Indian example. I don't think we should export any example to anybody else. We have enough to do ourselves at home, and we need to take care of us. But it's interesting because in India, at least, everybody is a minority, one way or the other, when you slice it by, ethnicity, caste, religion, creed, whatever, region, language. And the result is we stay a democracy because it's the only way that we can feel that we have a say in our own future, that we can build alliances with other minorities to work. So even though everybody wrote off Indian democracy in the 50s, it's survived and it's adapted to deal with this. So, and a big part of that is these multiple identities that we carry among ourselves. Whether that can transfer anywhere else, I don't know. I can't speak for the rest of the world. I mean, the rest of the world can see what we've done and whether it works. But it's a hard work in progress. It's never going to be easy. It's much harder than just saying we all believe in one identity, one language, one religion. It's so much easier and it's appealing to people. It looks efficient, but if you look at history, it's been the most inefficient and wasteful way of organizing ourselves. So yes, I do believe that multiple identities, plural identities are really the way forward for us. But I'm very reluctant to preach to anybody.
Thank you. Fidel?
Yes, thank you very much, Prof. Liberal regime is failing, as my dear general, retired general mentioned. I don't agree with that. He was not saying that. He was saying that yesterday. That was the topic on the floor. Now, in the case of Africa, we should say that post-colonial French arrangement is failing and not liberal regimes failing. We must separate that. I know because of the coup d'etats in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, many are quick to conclude that the whole Africa is rejecting democracy. No, they are rejecting post-colonial French arrangement. And I said this in Kenya earlier this year, that after the Second World War, many Francophone territories in Africa did not really gain independence as the British colonies and other colonies had. In that, it looked like an arranged system, the Francophonie, an arranged system, and a country, one particular country, Guinea, when Guinea decided to gain independence, in fact, it was severely punished. Medicine, road, asphalt, and all that were removed by the French and bent because Guinea decided that they would not be part of the French community. And after that, the kind of resource arrangement and other monetary arrangement that the French had with their colonies was more or less neo-colonial at best. And that is what is the Africa, Francophone Africa is fighting. And that is the main reason why the recent coup d'etats in the region seem to be happening in only Francophone countries and not the Anglophone ones. Yes, the Anglophone countries had had some coup experience in the 70s and 80s, but currently, the French colonies or former French colonies are the ones that are having this. So we must separate that. In fact, if you went around Africa, the youthful population, that is the youngest around the world. Africa has the youngest population in the world. And we are saying that many African youth are very opinionated. They want to be part of the state building. They want to express themselves freely. If you want to express yourself freely, a military leader is not your solution. A leader who is a dictator is not your solution. An autocrat is not your solution. So there is this kind of euphoria about some African youth who are just euphoric about having dictatorship. They listen to their parents talk about the military leaders of the 80s and the 70s, and there's this kind of euphoria. I always advise against it because then, in the beginning, they come like messiahs. They will solve all the problems in the country. But eventually, as they want to entrench themselves in power, they show their true colors. They will not let you talk the way you want to talk. They will not let you speak your mind the way you want to do it. So we currently see that in Guinea, we see that in Mali and other Burkina Faso and other places. They promise to hand over, but currently they are entrenched, and the use of pervasive propaganda and other means to stay on is happening. So I believe that liberal regimes are not necessarily failing, but it's the result of post-colonial French policy. And then you talk of democracy not for Africa, and I always say that I don't even agree with the phrase Western democracy. I don't believe in that. You know, as Africans, we had our own democratic principles. Chiefs in Africa could not say "l'état c'est moi," like what Louis said, King Louis said in France. Kings don't say that in Africa. They consult with their elders. The leadership is by consensus. It's not that an individual personalizes the state, as we see in the current dictators in Africa. We don't have that happening in the traditional sense. So I think that democracy is good for Africa, but it must have its own African uniqueness. It shouldn't be the kind that is practiced in Washington. It shouldn't be the kind that is practiced in, let's say, Portugal. Even in the West, we find different kinds of democratic systems. The presidential system of US is different from the parliamentary system of Italy. The neo-presidential system of France is different from the Westminster system of the United Kingdom. And so we have to create what is good for us, but essentially, the fundamentals of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the participation and all that should be universal and should be inalienable to every individual. Thank you for speaking so fast. Sorry for speaking so fast, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. You did speak well, no problem. Madalena.
Thank you very much for your question. I do agree with you that we live in a completely different setup in terms of how identities are formed, and anyone who sees teenagers growing up sees the speed with which fashions, cultural trends, identities change nowadays, and it's really something new, and it's a big challenge how to deal with this, and what is the role of the state, or what is the role of the education system? Is there some interfaces that we should create? Is there some regulations? I think I'm totally with you that this is what we have to think about. Thank you.
Fernando.
Thank you. Very brief again, regarding always I speak on behalf of Latin America. Identity was created with the creation of the republics in Latin America, in South America particularly, with the European seal, because it was created by Europeans. So our identity, a creation of national flags, national anthem, was a kind of, with some particular signs from our people in South America or in Latin America. Regarding to inequality, in my opinion, is completely linked with globalization, because globalization, what means globalization? What's the liberalization of the financial circuit in the world that started in the 90s. So the financial flows opened the financial market, the flow of goods and services everywhere. We see in Chile, we were one of the first countries to start at the time of dictatorship to open our barriers in a unilateral way. Was the destruction of the national kind of industry that we used to have. But the people start to buy products coming from everywhere in the world, particularly from Asia, with what never had a chance before to do it. So our market was full of new products that came to our countries. So globalization today is criticized, and in Chile we have radical sector from the left that start to say that we have to move to the deglobalization, to degrowth, because it's killing our system of life in some way. That was allow the extraction of minerals, raw material, our ocean, everything was open to the market. And we are damaging the planet also. So this is a big problem. Democracy, we were talking at the break today that in China, for instance, we have the root of Greece. In terms of democracy, we in Europe, in Latin America, we are form our system, political system based on what we understand by democracy. But what about China? Why China has to adopt the same system as we think is the best? It's a big problem. For us in Latin America, we faced yesterday, we spoke about China here. China has increased his trade with Latin America in 20 years, only in 20 years, from 18 billion US dollars to over 500 billions of US dollars. So we are full of Chinese products, Chinese investment, and so on. Is a political problem for the United States? It is. And is this also for the European Union? They send us messages. Be careful what they're doing with China. Be careful where they're investing. But they're creating jobs. So, and besides, we have the experience of the United States. The United States has today over 600 military bases around the world, about 50 in Latin America. China has not. China has today 2 military bases around the world, only 2. But they have about 600 Confucius Institute. In Chile, they have 2 or 3. So there's another way to use what is called the soft power. So I don't want to speak because...
Okay, Fernando, but you raised a question that I would pick up to introduce another question for you all, which is the deglobalization that some are asking for as a reaction to the negative effects of globalization. Is it happening? Is it possible? Is it compatible with modern economies? Can we do it? How can we control the negative effects while also recognizing that the main threats, or some of the main threats we're facing, are global and cannot be answered with national answers? For instance, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about pandemics, we're talking about cybercrime. All of these very, very important threats can only be faced through cooperation. The type of good that is at stake when we talk about that we need to protect regarding these threats are what we call network goods. Its utility is only exists if others have it beyond us. Vaccines. It's not enough that I have vaccines. I need the others to have it in order to all of us profit from that good. So building common security in relation to pandemics, to vaccination, will require a kind of global answer, more cooperation. Is this a paradox? How do we deal with it, Shankar?
Well, to the first question about are we deglobalizing, if you look at the share of world trade to global GDP, it's been above 60% since 2011. It's not going down. It fluctuates a bit, obviously, with the pandemic and so on, but it's well above 60% right through. And if you look at global value chains, manufacturing value chains have actually shortened in the last 12 years, but services value chains have actually grown longer. At least that's what the research shows. So I'm very nervous of using the word deglobalization. I think globalization, maybe it's being redefined within regions and so on. And in certain sectors, I mean, high technology, for instance, geopolitics has taken over. The politics determines. For chips, you've seen what's happened. But that's very limited when you look at it in terms of global trade as a whole. So we're not deglobalizing, despite all the sentiment. But I do want to make another point. You're absolutely right that all our big challenges now are transnational, whether it's climate change, whether it's the 53 developing countries who are at risk of debt defaults, which according to the IMF, whether it's terrorism, global terrorism, etc., etc. But our perceptions of that world have actually diverged. Perception has actually fragmented. I want to show you a slide. Can you show that slide? If the Munich Security Conference just asked in certain countries, which country do you think is the biggest rule breaker in the world? And look how different it is. Even the Global South doesn't agree within itself. India, of course, is the only country which thinks China is the biggest rule breaker, right? Brazil says it's Russia. Many countries say it's Russia. But if you look at Nigeria, Pakistan, South Africa, Turkey, for all of them, the US is the biggest rule breaker. Now, if you see the world so differently, if your perception of who is trustworthy, who is not trustworthy is so different, how are you ever going to attack these transnational problems that we mentioned? So first, you have to get people to at least see the world similarly. For me, this is a world between orders. I mean, we've been talking about this yesterday. It's a world adrift. It's not an orderly world at all. And this is why there's so much space for middle powers, for people to do what they want, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, whether it's Israel and Palestine. Everybody thinks now I can follow my own agenda and get away with it. Because it's a world without order. It's a world between orders rather than. So, but look at this perception. I mean, this is why I wanted to show it to you. This is what makes life hard for us. And what makes, frankly, make sure that diplomats have lifetime employment.
Wow, thank you. Impressive indeed. Fidel. Are you there?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so, sorry about that. That was an interruption. I think the question was about globalization. And so in the case of Africa, we always feel that we have not been treated well when it comes to the benefits of globalization, especially with global warming or climate change issues, where we seem to be asked to share the responsibility of those who have polluted the world the most. In the case of COVID, we realized that all other powerful countries or global north countries got enough of the vaccines before they even thought about Africa. And in case of some other outbreaks like Ebola and others, we also found the world sometimes not looking so much or prioritizing these things in Africa. So we have to always get around ourselves. Whenever we are in crisis, we solve it on our own. So some people have said that, well, we need more continentalization. Africa integrating more in order to be taken seriously in the global system. We feel that in terms of the global trade regime, others are benefiting while Africa is suffering. There's no fair trade. I mean, in terms of the rules apply differently. In terms of subsidies and things like that, that in some cases, some countries, more powerful countries, are allowed to give subsidies, but when it came to Africa, it was a taboo and things like that. So in Africa, we are divided on the benefits of globalization, that even in the political sphere, as I'm mentioning, that even when after the post-Cold War system did not change the attitude of, let's say, France towards its former colonies. So then many people raise questions as to if Africa really belongs to the globe or is part of the global process. People think that Africa is always put in the back burner at the expense of others. So then the question is, in terms of culture, political, economics, and other trade and others, should Africa first look within itself to forge a strong force in order to have fair deals with the external powers? Or African countries can go individually. We have 54 sovereign states. And you can imagine Ghana negotiating with China. How is Ghana going to benefit? Because, I mean, the budget of Shanghai alone is bigger than the whole economy of China or of Ghana. And so then, how is this going to be fair? So many people are actually asking for continentalization. And I think that is not a bad idea, but it has to do with how feasible that could be, because African states are also different in their makeup and the kind of levels, economic levels that they've attained. For instance, Angola, Algeria, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, and there's a fifth country, Egypt. These 5 countries cover 50% of the GDP of Africa, and the rest of the 49 countries have the 50%. So do you say that we are equal? I've always said that these bigger economies can create or could create the vortex that pulls the others along. So then there are questions of equality on the continent. Even if we want to go continentalization, how is it going to be? Do we have these stronger economies leading, or we pretend that we are all equal and fail together? So these are some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fidel. Madalena again.
Thank you for the. My point would be here that if we are indeed in a stable moment of how global trade is evolving, I nevertheless would point that politically, but also I think economically, we are heading for at least a division between the world, between what some people call the global West and the global East. And so it is not a deglobalization, but it is a fragmentation within the globe between 2 new poles, one with the US as its center and the other with China as its center. And for sure, we are watching already a rollback of the interdependence between the US and China for a few years. We are going to continue to see that. And the deepening of trade, for example, Russia and China are now trading in oil very, very happily and creating their own world, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding globalization, I would like to say that today, when the markets are open, and we can see what is going on, that people moving from one country to another, as the same as a good, but we are facing a new war because the United States raised tariff to the Chinese cars. Electric cars, as the same is doing European Union. Yeah, I would like to remember that some wars started as economic wars, and we are with the situation that we have, with war in Europe, war in the Middle East, our colleagues said yesterday, more than 50 wars are taking place in the world today, that we're in a very dangerous situation. And I will remember that the Romans, that were very wise in some things, they used to say, only trade brings peace. So I don't know what is going to happen really, but I'm very concerned about the future.
Well, we're concerned about the future, not really concerned about time. We still have time for 1 or 2 questions. So please go ahead. Even though I can see that the gentleman over there with the poster is having problems to find the space. This panel is so intense that it's providing a lot of topics and subtopics, but this is good also. So please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mauricio. I'm a student here in Lisbon. I want to thank you all for the discussions and the knowledge that you've shared with us. And my question is, now coming to the end of the session and with all the ideas that you have expressed, which I don't want to resume, but what can you tell the young generations that they should do? We have a lot of students here, just as myself here. And yes, what do you think about them? What should their role be? What should they be working on? Because all these problems are political, economical, inequality, and as Ambassador Ayala said, we don't really have the answer right now, but what is it that we have to focus on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very important question. A final question? Another one? No, that's it. So we're going for the final round of questions. Shankar, please.
to the young, think for yourself, don't do what we did, and concentrate on creating outcomes rather than narratives or stories or, forget about impressing people, but create outcomes. But best of luck. I'm sure you'll do better than we did.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a young person myself, so I would prefer to listen to all of them. Yes, so I'm part of the. I want to be part of the recipient of the advice.
Okay, Fidel, that is not fair. I understand this is the most difficult question, but I'm glad it was put. So, Madalena, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's very good. I often think that the young generation has a few challenges ahead, of course, and it is a bit daunting. But I also feel that there's too much of a gloom and doom atmosphere over your heads, and that's very how to say. I think it's hard to face that, but I think you should also question whether that is so. Of course, there are big problems, but there have been big problems. Europe went through very hard 20th century, and it kind of came out of that. So I would question a bit this gloom and doom atmosphere that hangs over you, that I perceive at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Mauricio, I will quote what Winston Churchill used to say to the young people. Read history, and I will add, get involved in politics. We failed, because look at how the world is today. We failed. The world order has changed only with the First World War and the Second World War, the international order changed. We have to change the international order, but we are going to have a third world war to improve the world order, to change the structure that we received from the 1945 until today with the Security Council, 5 countries that control the world. We need to destroy, we need another war. So get involved in politics, and you, the new generation, have the task to try to change this situation.
Thank you. Fidel, so now you heard everybody. What do you have to say?
Okay, thank you. So I will thank everybody for this good advice. Yes, the youth, now we find ourselves in the midst of so much information, but what the difficulty is to know what information is right. So now we see a lot of disinformation, AI generating a lot of information that we can't even understand, but we sometimes swallow this information hook, line, sinker. So I think that my simple advice is that the youth should be able to know the difference between fake news, what is false news, and what is authentic. That is very important. And that should be fundamental in our effort to get educated, because education is a continuous process. And in doing so, we must get the right information. Other than that, we may take some decisions based on falsehood. And when decisions are based on falsehood, the results could be very disastrous. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We are getting to the end of our panel. So maybe I can give you my 5 cents with regard to this final question, while at the same time trying to wrap up and identify some of the main takeaways from this session. The first thing is, the first part, we all realized how important it is to give up our ethnocentric visions of this type of phenomena. There is a huge variety in time and space, so it's really important take account of the different contexts, the different expressions of this same phenomena, and be careful when we use these very contested concepts. And I think you all gave us a lot of input to understand the variety of situations when we talk about globalization or nationalism, what it means in different contexts in the world throughout time. So this is very important. And the second thing is regards what to do, and comes to this final question. And I think we for sure had two types of answers. On the one hand, we need to act on structural dimensions. That is, we need to develop political instruments to fight inequality and to strengthen democracy. And have modalities of political action that will allow us to face all these structural problems and go on, and this is not new, but face them, since we know that they are still there and they are still provoking much of the negative consequences we are observing. But we also know that now we have this new phenomena together with the technological developments and disinformation, Fidel just raised it, that means we have to work on the symbolic dimension, on narratives, on identities, which are constructed, which are not stable, which change. So intervening means combating disinformation, an order between orders where some people are taking advantage of this weaponization of uncertainty, to generate fear, because fear then generates the need for security, and that's why people will more probably accept messianic, autocratic leaders that bring security, that to face fear. So what we need is narratives, identity processes that build on the good sides of cohesion, of community, and not on the exclusion side of nationalism or identity building processes. We need to work on that. We need to face the most, I think, terrible problem of our times in this sense, which is the lack of trust. All this, the lack of trust is feeding all the most terrible phenomena we have been talking about. And to build trust, we need political instruments, we need people to read history, we need people to get involved in politics, we need to talk, we need to debate, and that's what we've been doing here, because in between orders, we are helping by doing this to build the new order, and we are agents of this. So thank you all very much for your wonderful inputs, the panel. Thank you to the audience, the questions, and join me in a round of applause to our wonderful panel this morning.